The moment you see an enemy save your child before his own soldier, something inside you breaks forever. Spring 1945 arrived quietly in a small coastal village in southern Japan, but the quiet was strange, heavy, like the air before a storm. The narrow dirt road that wound through the village still smelled faintly of smoke and seawater, and broken roof tiles lay scattered across gardens where peach trees were just beginning to bloom. Nurse Aiko Tanaka stood beside a wooden doorway that no longer had a door, her white nurse's armband smudged with dust, her dark hair tied tightly behind her head the way she had worn it through 3 years of war. Around her, several Japanese nurses worked silently, tending to civilians who had taken shelter inside the remains of the schoolhouse. No one spoke louder than a whisper. They all knew American troops had landed less than 20 miles away. For months they had heard the stories told by officers, by newspapers, by frightened soldiers returning from the coast. The Americans would show no mercy. They would destroy everything. They would treat prisoners with cruelty. Aiko had repeated those warnings to younger nurses many times. Yet now, standing in the pale morning light, she felt something different in the air, something uncertain. In the corner of the room a small boy, no older than 7, lay on a thin blanket placed over the wooden floor. His breathing was shallow but steady. Aiko had already done what she could with the limited supplies left in the medical bag beside her. A bandage, cool water, a careful check of his pulse. But they needed proper medicine, the kind that had been impossible to find for months. Outside, the distant rumble of engines rolled across the hills. The sound froze every nurse in place. Trucks. More than one. Aiko slowly stepped toward the shattered window frame and looked down the road. A column of olive-drab vehicles was moving toward the village, dust rising behind their tires as sunlight flashed across metal hoods and windshields. American vehicles. No one ran. No one screamed. The nurses simply stood there, stiff and silent, waiting for whatever came next. The first jeep stopped about 20 yards from the schoolhouse. For a moment the engine kept running, a low mechanical hum that filled the quiet street. Then the driver shut it off, and the sudden silence felt louder than the engine had been. The passenger door opened. A tall American officer stepped down onto the dirt road. His uniform was dusty, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a red cross stitched onto the armband above his left arm. Captain Daniel Whitaker, United States Army Medical Corps. Aiko did not know his name yet, but she would remember his face for the rest of her life. He paused beside the jeep and looked at the damaged buildings, the scattered debris, the frightened civilians watching from doorways and windows. His eyes moved slowly, carefully, the way a doctor studies a patient. Behind him 2 American medics climbed from the back of the vehicle carrying canvas medical bags. None of them raised a weapon. None of them shouted orders. They simply walked forward. Aiko felt her heartbeat quicken. This was the moment she had been warned about for years. The moment when the enemy finally arrived. She stepped away from the window and moved closer to the boy lying on the blanket, almost as if standing near him might somehow protect him. Footsteps approached the doorway. Heavy boots on gravel. A shadow crossed the floor. Captain Whitaker stepped inside the ruined schoolhouse, paused just inside the entrance, and took in the scene. Japanese nurses. Civilians. A wounded child. For 2 full seconds no one spoke. Then the American captain did something none of them expected. He walked past the adults, past the nurses, past the frightened soldiers sitting against the far wall, and he knelt beside the boy on the floor. Captain Daniel Whitaker did not speak immediately. He placed his medical bag on the floor beside the blanket and studied the small boy with the calm, careful attention of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The room was so quiet that Aiko could hear the faint creak of the leather strap as he opened the bag. The American medic behind him shifted slightly, but said nothing. Whitaker rested 2 fingers lightly against the child's wrist, counting the rhythm of the pulse while his eyes watched the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest. For a moment Aiko forgot that this man was supposed to be her enemy. He did not look like the terrifying figure she had imagined during years of war. He looked like a doctor. The boy stirred weakly beneath the blanket. And Whitaker spoke softly, his voice low and steady, a tone used by doctors everywhere when they want frightened patients to remain calm. The words were English and Aiko did not understand them, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was reassurance. Whitaker glanced toward the doorway and spoke to one of the American medics. The medic immediately stepped forward, setting down another canvas bag and kneeling beside him. Metal instruments touched the wooden floor with a soft clink as they prepared what they needed. Aiko felt the other nurses watching the same thing she was watching, each of them standing frozen between suspicion and disbelief. In every story they had heard about the Americans, this was not how the moment was supposed to begin. The captain carefully cleaned a small wound on the boy's arm, his movements precise and practiced. The boy flinched slightly, then relaxed as Whitaker worked with patient, deliberate care. Outside the broken window, a warm breeze moved through the peach trees, carrying the faint smell of salt from the ocean less than a mile away. Another American soldier appeared at the doorway then, leaning against the frame as if waiting for instructions. His uniform was dusty and his expression tired. One of the medics glanced toward Whitaker and said something quietly. The soldier was clearly injured and needed attention. Aiko recognized the posture of someone who had been waiting too long for treatment. Whitaker looked up briefly at the soldier, studying him for a single silent moment. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Whitaker returned his attention to the child and spoke calmly, the words simple and direct. The soldier can wait. Children first. The American medic nodded immediately and stepped back toward the doorway, as if the decision required no discussion at all. The soldier did not protest. He simply leaned against the wooden frame and waited. Aiko felt something shift in her chest that she could not explain. In every military hospital she had worked in, soldiers had always come first. Always. It was the rule repeated again and again during training. Soldiers were the priority because soldiers protected the nation. Civilians came after. Yet here, in the quiet ruin of a village schoolhouse, the American officer had reversed that rule without hesitation. Whitaker finished securing the bandage around the boy's arm and gently adjusted the blanket. When the child opened his eyes briefly, Whitaker offered a small reassuring smile. Aiko realized that her hands had slowly unclenched at her sides. She had been bracing herself for cruelty that never came. Instead, she was watching something that made no sense at all. For several seconds, no one moved. The boy on the blanket breathed more evenly now, the fresh bandage wrapped neatly around his arm, and Captain Daniel Whitaker slowly closed the small metal case he had taken from his bag. The quiet inside the broken schoolhouse felt almost fragile, like thin glass that might shatter if someone spoke too loudly. Outside, the breeze moved softly through the shattered window frame, carrying the distant sound of waves rolling onto the shore less than half a mile away. Aiko Tanaka stood beside the wooden pillar near the center of the room, watching the American officer with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a language she had never been taught. Whitaker reached into his bag again and removed a small bottle and a folded cloth. He handed them to the medic beside him and spoke quietly, giving instructions in calm, measured English. The medic nodded and stepped toward the boy to continue the treatment. Whitaker then rose slowly to his feet and turned his head toward the rest of the room for the first time since he entered. His eyes moved from one face to another. Japanese nurses, elderly villagers, two young soldiers sitting against the far wall with their uniforms dusty and worn. None of them had expected to see this moment. For years the war had been described in simple words: enemy and ally, victory and defeat. Yet the scene unfolding inside the damaged schoolhouse did not resemble the stories anyone had heard. One of the American medics stepped outside briefly and returned carrying a small wooden crate that had been taken from the jeep. Inside were neatly arranged medical supplies wrapped in brown paper, bottles, clean bandages, instruments that reflected the pale sunlight drifting through the broken roof beams. Aiko felt a sudden tightening in her chest when she saw the supplies. For months their clinic had been running on almost nothing. Cloth washed and reused. Bottles half empty. Every day had been a careful calculation of what little they had left. Whitaker opened the crate and examined its contents with a quick glance, then nodded once as if confirming something to himself. He turned toward Aiko for the first time. Their eyes met across the small room. For a moment neither of them spoke. Aiko felt the familiar instinct to lower her gaze, the habit of deference drilled into her during years of military training. But something stopped her. The American officer was not looking at her the way soldiers looked at captured enemies. His expression was calm, focused, almost curious. Whitaker lifted one hand slightly and gestured toward the injured boy, then toward the crate of supplies. His voice was steady and direct when he spoke. The words were English, but his meaning was clear even before the medic beside him quietly translated a few simple phrases into careful Japanese learned during months of training. "We help everyone here." For a moment Aiko could not answer. The other nurses exchanged uncertain glances, their faces showing the same confusion she felt. Help everyone. The phrase sounded simple, yet it contradicted almost everything they had been told about the enemy across the ocean. Whitaker knelt again beside the child to check the bandage one more time, adjusting the cloth with the same gentle patience he had shown earlier. The soldier still waiting in the doorway shifted his weight slightly, leaning against the frame while the sunlight touched the dust on his uniform sleeves. He continued to wait without complaint. Aiko looked from the soldier to the child, and then back to the American captain. The quiet truth of the moment settled slowly into the room. The enemy doctor had chosen the child first, and nothing about that decision seemed accidental. The room remained quiet after the American captain spoke those simple words. "We help everyone here." The sentence seemed to settle in the air like dust drifting through the narrow beams of sunlight that slipped through the broken roof. Aiko Tanaka stood still beside the wooden pillar, her mind turning slowly as she tried to understand what she had just witnessed. For years she had worked inside military hospitals where every decision followed strict order and discipline. Soldiers first, civilians later, orders above emotion. Yet the man kneeling on the wooden floor only a few feet away had ignored that entire structure as if it did not exist. Captain Daniel Whitaker checked the boy's pulse once more, his fingers resting gently against the small wrist while his eyes measured the rhythm with quiet concentration. When he seemed satisfied, he carefully covered the child with the thin blanket and nodded to the medic beside him. The medic adjusted the bandage and then reached for a small notebook, writing something down before closing the cover again. Outside the schoolhouse, another vehicle engine shut down, and the faint metallic click echoed down the street as more American medics stepped from the truck carrying additional medical bags. They moved with calm efficiency, not rushing, not shouting, simply working the way trained professionals do when they arrive at a place where help is needed. One of them carried a metal container filled with clean water. Another unfolded a small portable table and placed it near the doorway where the light was strongest. Within minutes, the quiet ruin of the village classroom had begun to resemble a field clinic. Aiko watched every movement carefully. The Americans did not separate people by uniform or nationality. They moved from one patient to the next with the same steady attention. An elderly fisherman with a sprained ankle received the same careful bandage as a young soldier sitting against the far wall. A mother holding a coughing infant was guided gently to the table where a medic listened to the child's breathing with a small instrument that gleamed in the light. Each action was quiet, deliberate, almost ordinary. That ordinariness unsettled Aiko more than anything else. War was supposed to divide people into enemies and allies. Yet the Americans seemed to be ignoring those lines completely. She stepped forward slowly, almost without realizing she had moved. Captain Whitaker noticed immediately. He stood and faced her, his posture relaxed but attentive. Up close, she could see faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the kind that appear after months of long nights and endless patience. He spoke again, slower this time, choosing his words carefully as if he understood she might catch only fragments of meaning. "If you are a nurse, you can help us." Aiko felt the weight of every gaze in the room turned toward her. The other nurses watched silently, unsure what she would do. For a moment, the years of training pressed against her instincts like an invisible wall. Helping the enemy had never been discussed in any manual. But another image rose in her mind at the same time. The American captain kneeling beside the wounded child without hesitation. The soldier waiting patiently in the doorway while the boy was treated first. Slowly Aiko nodded. She stepped toward the crate of medical supplies and reached for a clean roll of bandage. The American medic beside her moved slightly to give her space. No one spoke. Yet something in the room had changed the moment her hands joined theirs. The first bandage Aiko Tanaka unrolled from the American supply crate felt strangely unfamiliar in her hands. The cloth was thicker than the worn fabric they had been reusing for months, clean and bright against the dim interior of the damaged schoolhouse. For a moment, she simply held it, feeling the weight of the decision she had already made. Then she turned toward the elderly fisherman sitting near the wall and knelt beside him the way she had done thousands of times before the war had turned every routine action into something uncertain. Across the room, Captain Daniel Whitaker watched quietly for a moment before returning to his work beside another patient. The faint tension that had filled the air earlier seemed to loosen slightly as the Americans and the Japanese nurses began moving within the same space without hesitation. Aiko wrapped the bandage carefully around the fisherman's ankle while speaking to him in a calm voice, the same reassuring tone she had used with patients for years. The old man nodded gratefully, his weathered hands resting on his knees as she secured the cloth with a small metal clip. When she finished, she looked up briefly and noticed that Whitaker had moved closer to the doorway where the American soldier was still waiting. The soldier had remained there for nearly 20 minutes, leaning against the wooden frame while the others received treatment first. Whitaker gestured for him to sit on the portable chair that one of the medics had unfolded near the entrance. The soldier obeyed without complaint, lowering himself slowly into the chair while Whitaker examined his arm with the same steady attention he had given the child earlier. Aiko watched the exchange from across the room. The soldier spoke a few quiet words that made the medic beside him smile briefly before handing Whitaker a fresh bandage from the crate. Nothing in their expressions suggested frustration or resentment about the delay. They behaved as if waiting had been the natural thing to do. Aiko returned to the crate for another roll of cloth and noticed how organized the supplies were inside. Bottles labeled in careful English handwriting. Instruments wrapped in sterile paper. Small packets of medicine arranged in neat rows. It was the kind of preparation that spoke of long experience. Outside the open doorway, more villagers had begun approaching cautiously, drawn by the sight of the medical team working inside the ruined schoolhouse. A mother carrying a toddler stepped into the doorway, hesitating when she saw both American soldiers and Japanese nurses inside the same room. One of the American medics noticed her uncertainty and gave a gentle nod, stepping aside so she could enter. Aiko watched as the medic knelt to examine the child, while speaking softly to calm the worried mother. The simple kindness of the gesture echoed something Whitaker had said earlier. "We help everyone here." The words returned to her mind with unexpected clarity. They did not sound like a command or a slogan. They sounded like a rule that existed beyond the war itself. For the first time since the American vehicles had arrived, the room no longer felt divided into opposing sides. It felt like a place where doctors and nurses were simply doing the work they had been trained to do. Aiko tied off another bandage and looked toward Whitaker again. He was finishing his treatment of the soldier now, adjusting the cloth around the arm before patting the man lightly on the shoulder. The soldier stood and stepped aside to allow the next patient forward. The quiet rhythm of care continued without interruption, as if the war outside the village had paused for a few brief hours inside the walls of the broken schoolhouse. By late morning, the broken schoolhouse no longer felt like a place of waiting and fear. The quiet rhythm of work had taken over, steady and almost familiar, the way a hospital ward sounds when doctors and nurses move through their duties with practiced calm. Sunlight had climbed higher through the shattered roof beams, laying warm stripes of light across the wooden floor where medical bags, folded cloth, and small glass bottles rested in careful order. Aiko Tanaka moved from one patient to the next with the same focused patience she had learned during her training years before the war. Yet something inside her had changed without her fully noticing when. It happened. The hesitation that had filled her earlier was gone. Her hands worked naturally beside the American medics, passing instruments, preparing clean bandages, and checking pulses with quiet concentration. Across the room, Captain Daniel Whitaker paused beside the portable table where the mother and her toddler sat. The child had begun to cry softly during the examination, the unfamiliar faces and strange language making the small room feel overwhelming. Whitaker lowered his voice and spoke gently while the medic beside him prepared a spoonful of medicine from a small bottle. The mother watched every movement carefully, her expression still cautious but no longer fearful. The toddler slowly calmed as Whitaker adjusted the child's blanket and handed the spoon to the mother with a reassuring nod. The moment lasted only a few seconds, yet Aiko noticed how naturally the American officer treated the worried parent, as if comforting frightened families had always been part of his work. Near the doorway, another medic finished arranging the remaining supplies on the wooden crate that now served as a temporary cabinet. Rows of small paper packets sat neatly beside clean cloth rolls and metal instruments wrapped in protective covers. Aiko realized with quiet amazement how much care had been taken to prepare these materials before the Americans ever arrived in the village. Nothing about their work looked rushed or careless. It carried the calm efficiency of people who had done the same task many times before. Outside the open doorway, the village street had grown busier. Word had spread that doctors had arrived. Several fishermen from the harbor walked slowly toward the building, guiding an older man between them whose breathing sounded strained from the long walk uphill from the shoreline. One of the American medics stepped forward immediately, helping the man into a chair while speaking reassuringly in slow English. Aiko moved closer with a stethoscope from the crate and handed it to Whitaker without needing to be asked. For a brief moment their hands brushed as he took the instrument. Whitaker gave a small nod of appreciation before placing the metal disc gently against the old man's chest to listen to his breathing. The sound of the waves carried faintly through the open doorway, mixing with the quiet voices inside the room. Patients waited patiently along the walls, some speaking softly with the nurses while others simply watched the unusual cooperation unfolding around them. Aiko noticed the boy who had been treated first now sitting upright on his blanket, his eyes following the movements of the doctors with quiet curiosity. The bandage on his arm looked bright and clean against his small sleeve. Whitaker finished listening to the older fisherman's breathing and offered a few calm instructions to the medic beside him before turning briefly toward Aiko. He gestured toward the boy with a small smile that carried no triumph, only quiet reassurance. In that moment Aiko understood something she had never expected to learn during the war. The Americans had not come to prove they were stronger. They had come to prove something else entirely, something that could only be shown through patience, bandages, and the simple act of choosing who to help first. The afternoon light slowly shifted across the wooden floor as the quiet work inside the schoolhouse continued. Dust floated gently through the warm air, glowing in the pale gold beams that slipped through the broken roof. Outside, the sound of the ocean rose and fell in a steady rhythm against the distant shoreline, a reminder that the world beyond the village still moved forward even while this small room had become a place suspended between two sides of a war. Aiko Tanaka finished tying the final knot on a clean bandage wrapped around the arm of a young fisherman and sat back on her heels for a moment, allowing herself a brief breath. The fisherman bowed his head gratefully before standing and stepping carefully toward the door. Another villager quietly took his place on the chair beside the wooden crate that now held the remaining medical supplies. Across the room, Captain Daniel Whitaker was speaking softly with one of his medics while reviewing a small notebook filled with patient notes. His voice carried the calm tone of a doctor who had spent years making careful decisions in crowded field hospitals. Every movement he made seemed deliberate and unhurried, as if he understood that the people watching him were learning something simply by observing the way he worked. The boy who had been treated first now sat near the window with his back against the wall, the thin blanket still draped over his shoulders. His eyes followed the medics moving through the room with quiet fascination. From time to time, he touched the fresh bandage on his arm as if confirming it was still there. Aiko noticed the child's mother sitting beside him, her posture no longer tense but relaxed in a way that would have been impossible only a few hours earlier. She spoke quietly to her son while occasionally glancing toward Whitaker with an expression that held both curiosity and gratitude. Near the doorway, the American soldier who had waited earlier was now helping one of the medics carry a small crate of additional water bottles into the room. The soldier moved slowly but without complaint, setting the crate down beside the portable table before returning to his seat along the wall. His presence among the villagers no longer felt strange. The lines that once separated everyone in the room had faded into something far less rigid. Aiko walked toward the crate of supplies and carefully arranged the remaining rolls of cloth and bottles into neat rows, a habit formed during years of hospital work. As she did, she heard Whitaker step closer behind her. He spoke quietly, his English measured and gentle, then repeated a few words more slowly so she might understand. "You are a good nurse." The simple sentence surprised her more than she expected. Praise had never been part of military medical training. Nurses were taught to work hard, follow orders, and move on to the next patient without pause. Yet Whitaker's words carried no formality. They sounded sincere, spoken from one professional to another. Aiko inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement before answering in careful English she had learned years earlier in school. "Thank you, Captain." The exchange lasted only a moment before another patient approached the table, yet something about the brief conversation lingered in the air between them. The work resumed, steady and quiet, but the room now held a different feeling entirely. What had begun as a meeting between enemies had slowly become something else. A place where doctors and nurses from opposite sides of a war had discovered that the work of healing followed rules older than any battlefield. The afternoon sun had begun to lean toward the western hills, and the light entering the schoolhouse changed from pale gold to a deeper amber that stretched long shadows across the wooden floor. The work inside the room continued with the same quiet rhythm that had slowly replaced the fear of the morning. Medical bags lay open beside the portable table, and the last rows of clean bandages were stacked carefully inside the wooden crate. Aiko Tanaka moved calmly between the remaining patients, her steps steady, her hands confident as she finished checking the pulse of an elderly woman who had walked nearly a mile down from the hillside farms after hearing that doctors had arrived in the village. The woman smiled gently as Aiko adjusted the cloth around her wrist and whispered a few reassuring words before helping her stand. Across the room, Captain Daniel Whitaker stood near the window where the injured boy now sat upright, the blanket still wrapped loosely around his shoulders. The child had grown curious enough to watch every movement of the medics with wide, attentive eyes. Whitaker crouched beside him again, examining the bandage on the boy's arm to ensure it remained secure. The captain spoke softly, his voice calm and patient, though the boy could only understand a few words. Yet the tone alone carried its meaning clearly. The boy nodded slowly, as if he understood that the tall American doctor meant him no harm. Outside, the sound of footsteps approached along the dirt road. Another group of villagers appeared at the doorway, their faces cautious but hopeful. Word had spread quickly along the shoreline and through the nearby farms that the Americans had turned the damaged schoolhouse into a place of care rather than a place of fear. One of Whitaker's medics stepped forward immediately to greet the newcomers, guiding them inside with the same quiet professionalism that had filled the room all afternoon. Aiko paused for a moment near the supply crate and allowed herself to look around the room fully for the first time since the work had begun. The sight felt almost impossible to explain. American soldiers and Japanese nurses moved around one another with easy cooperation, passing instruments, sharing water, and speaking in a mixture of slow English, careful Japanese, and the universal gestures that medical workers everywhere understand without translation. Even the villagers waiting along the wall no longer seemed tense. Some spoke quietly with the American medics, while others watched the scene with a quiet sense of relief that had not existed earlier in the day. Captain Whitaker finished adjusting the boy's bandage and rose slowly to his feet. As he stood, he glanced across the room toward Aiko. For a brief moment their eyes met again. This time the look carried something different from the cautious curiosity of the morning. It carried recognition, not as enemies standing on opposite sides of a battlefield, but as two people who had spent the entire day doing the same work for the same reason. Aiko realized that the silence between them held a shared understanding that required no explanation. Hours earlier, the Americans had arrived as strangers in a frightened village. Now the schoolhouse felt like something else entirely. A temporary clinic where the rules of compassion had quietly replaced the rules of war, one patient at a time. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the light inside the schoolhouse softened into a quiet amber glow, and the long day of work began to slow. The stream of villagers arriving at the doorway had grown smaller as word spread that most of the urgent cases had already been treated. Outside, the air carried the gentle scent of the nearby ocean and the faint rustle of wine through the peach trees that bordered the road. Inside, the improvised clinic looked calmer than it had at any moment since morning. Medical instruments were being cleaned and wrapped carefully in cloth. Empty bottles were stacked neatly inside the wooden crate. Aiko Tanaka rinsed her hands in a basin of cool water that one of the American medics had placed beside the portable table. The water felt refreshing against her tired fingers after hours of steady work. She dried her hands slowly on a clean cloth and looked around the room with quiet reflection. Patients who had arrived earlier in pain or fear now sat resting along the wall, speaking softly with family members or with the nurses who had helped them. The small boy who had been treated first had fallen asleep again near the window, the late sunlight warming the blanket across his shoulders. His mother sat beside him, watching the room with an expression that held a calm gratitude she had not been able to show earlier. Captain Daniel Whitaker stood near the doorway speaking with one of his medics while reviewing the final notes in his small notebook. The conversation was quiet, practical, the kind of exchange that happens at the end of a long medical shift when doctors ensure that nothing has been overlooked. When Whitaker closed the notebook, he looked across the room once more, his eyes briefly pausing on the sleeping child before moving toward Aiko. She stepped closer as he approached, sensing that the day was reaching its final moments. Whitaker spoke slowly in English, choosing words carefully so that she might understand them without the need for translation. "We will return tomorrow morning. Some patients may need to be checked again." Aiko nodded. Her English was not perfect, but she understood the meaning clearly. She answered in the same careful tone she had used earlier. "The villagers will be here. They trust the doctors now." Whitaker listened, then gave a small, thoughtful nod. The simple exchange carried a quiet significance neither of them needed to explain. A few hours earlier, the arrival of American vehicles on the village road had filled the schoolhouse with tension and uncertainty. Now the same space felt almost peaceful. Outside the doorway, one of the American medics started the Jeep engine, the low sound of the motor drifting through the evening air. Another medic lifted the remaining medical bags and secured them carefully inside the vehicle. The preparation to leave had begun. Aiko walked toward the sleeping boy near the window and adjusted the edge of the blanket so that the evening breeze would not disturb him. As she stood again, she glanced toward Whitaker, who was stepping outside to check the vehicles before departure. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to think about the strange simplicity of the day. The enemy soldiers had arrived with medical bags instead of weapons. They had treated children before their own men. And somewhere between morning and evening, the meaning of the word enemy had quietly begun to change. The last patient stepped slowly out of the schoolhouse as the sky beyond the doorway turned a deeper shade of evening blue. The quiet clinic that had formed during the day was beginning to dissolve back into the familiar shape of the empty building it had once been. Wooden desks pushed against the walls, cracked windows open to the breeze, and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath careful footsteps as the American medics packed their remaining equipment. Aiko Tanaka stood near the center of the room for a moment, watching the careful order in which the Americans closed their medical bags and wrapped the instruments in clean cloth. Nothing was rushed. Even the ending of the day carried the same calm discipline that had guided every treatment since morning. Captain Daniel Whitaker stepped back inside after checking the vehicles parked along the dusty road. The engine of the Jeep idled quietly outside, its steady hum blending with the distant sound of waves rolling against the shoreline. Whitaker glanced once more across the room, his eyes moving from the resting villagers to the sleeping boy near the window. The child had not stirred, his breathing steady beneath the blanket that covered his shoulders. The boy's mother noticed Whitaker's glance and bowed her head slightly in silent gratitude. The gesture was small but unmistakable. Whitaker returned the nod with the quiet respect of someone who understood exactly what the moment meant. Aiko moved toward the crate where the remaining bandages had been arranged earlier. Only a few rolls remained now, along with a small bottle of medicine and several folded cloths. Whitaker noticed her looking at the supplies and spoke gently. "We will leave these here tonight. Some people may still need them." Aiko listened carefully and nodded in agreement. The simple decision felt natural after the work they had shared throughout the day. One of the American medics carried the final medical bag toward the doorway and secured it inside the Jeep, while another closed the wooden lid of the crate and slid it closer to the wall where it would remain safe. The room grew quieter with each step of preparation. Outside, the fading sunlight painted the village road in soft orange light, touching the peach trees and the weathered rooftops with a warm glow that felt peaceful after the long hours of tension that had once filled the same streets. Whitaker paused beside the doorway and looked back one final time. His gaze rested briefly on Aiko. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them carried everything that had happened since morning. The arrival of strangers, the careful work beside one another, the small boy who had been treated first while an American soldier waited patiently at the door. Aiko realized that the memory of that decision would remain with her long after the vehicles disappeared down the road. Whitaker lifted his hand in a simple gesture of farewell before stepping outside. The Jeep engine grew louder as the medic behind the wheel prepared to leave. Aiko walked to the doorway and watched as the vehicle slowly turned along the narrow road that curved toward the hills. Dust rose gently behind the tires before settling again across the quiet village. The sound of the engines faded little by little until only the ocean could be heard again in the distance. Inside the schoolhouse, the room stood almost empty now, yet something of the day remained in the quiet air. Aiko looked once more at the sleeping boy near the window, and then at the crate of supplies left beside the wall. In that silent moment, she understood that the war outside might continue for many more days. But inside this small village, one truth had already become impossible to forget. The evening settled slowly over the village after the American vehicles disappeared along the narrow road that curved toward the hills. The sound of the engines faded completely, leaving only the steady rhythm of the ocean in the distance and the quiet voices of villagers gathering outside the schoolhouse. Inside, the room had grown calm again, but it no longer felt like the same place it had been that morning. The wooden desks still stood along the walls, the cracked windows still opened toward the fading light. Yet the air held a different weight now. Aiko Tanaka moved carefully across the floor, her footsteps slow after the long hours of work. The crate of medical supplies left by Captain Daniel Whitaker rested beside the wall exactly where the medics had placed it. She knelt beside it and lifted the wooden lid. Inside, the remaining bandages and bottles were arranged with the same neat precision she had noticed earlier. Even the smallest instruments had been wrapped carefully in clean cloth before the Americans departed. The sight of the supplies stirred a quiet realization in her mind. They had not left the village empty-handed. They had left something behind that would continue the work they had started. Near the window, the small boy stirred beneath the blanket and slowly opened his eyes. His mother leaned closer and whispered gently to him, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. The boy looked around the room with sleepy curiosity, as if trying to remember everything that had happened during the long day. His gaze paused on the bandage wrapped neatly around his arm. Aiko stepped closer and knelt beside him. She checked the cloth carefully, to make sure it remained secure. The boy watched her with quiet trust now, no longer frightened by the unfamiliar sounds and faces that had filled the room earlier. Outside, a few fishermen had gathered near the doorway, speaking softly among themselves. The village had begun to understand what had taken place inside the schoolhouse. News traveled quickly along the narrow coastal roads and between the small hillside farms. American soldiers had arrived, yet they had come with doctors instead of weapons. They had treated children first. They had shared their supplies with the nurses of the village. The story was already moving from house to house as the evening deepened. Aiko stood and walked slowly toward the doorway. The last of the sunset painted the horizon in soft orange and purple colors above the ocean. The road where the jeeps had disappeared lay quiet now, dust settling gently over the tire tracks left behind. For a moment she imagined the vehicles continuing along that road toward the next village that might need help. Perhaps another schoolhouse. Another group of frightened civilians waiting to see what the arriving soldiers would do. Behind her the room remained peaceful. The boy had closed his eyes again, the blanket rising and falling with each slow breath. The crate of medical supplies waited beside the wall, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Aiko rested one hand against the wooden doorframe and looked out across the quiet village street. The war had not ended. Everyone knew that. But something important had changed inside her understanding of it. Earlier that morning she had expected the enemy to arrive as something distant and frightening. Instead, she had watched a doctor kneel beside a wounded child and say 3 simple words that had altered everything she believed about the people on the other side of the ocean. Children first. The night arrived quietly over the village, bringing a cool breeze from the ocean that drifted through the broken windows of the schoolhouse. The sky above the dark outline of the hills had turned deep blue, and the first stars had begun to appear over the water. Inside the building, a lantern now rested on one of the wooden desks, its soft glow spreading warm light across the floor where the day's work had taken place. Aiko Tanaka remained inside long after most of the villagers had returned to their homes. The long hours of the afternoon had left her tired, yet her mind felt unusually awake. She walked slowly across the room once more, pausing beside the crate of supplies the Americans had left behind. The wooden lid creaked softly as she opened it again. The neat rows of bandages and medicine bottles looked exactly as they had earlier, untouched, patient, waiting. She ran her fingers lightly across the clean cloth rolls and thought about the quiet certainty in Captain Daniel Whitaker's voice when he had said they would return in the morning. The promise had not sounded like a military plan. It had sounded like something simpler. A doctor returning to check his patients. Near the window, the small boy shifted slightly beneath the blanket and sat up, his eyes adjusting to the lantern light. His mother spoke softly to him, explaining that the doctors would come back tomorrow. The boy listened carefully, then looked at the bandage on his arm again before nodding with a seriousness that made Aiko smile faintly. Even children understood when kindness was genuine. Outside, the narrow road that led through the village lay empty beneath the moonlight. The tire marks left by the departing jeeps were still visible in the dust, pale lines stretching toward the hills. Aiko stepped into the doorway and looked along that road for a long moment. She imagined the Americans traveling through the dark countryside, perhaps stopping in another village before the night was over. Perhaps another schoolhouse would become a temporary clinic the way this one had. The thought made the war feel strangely different from the way it had been described for so many years. Behind her, the lantern flickered gently, illuminating the quiet room that had witnessed something unexpected during the day. The desks pushed against the walls, the open windows, the crate of supplies, and the sleeping child beside the window had all become part of a memory that would remain long after the lantern burned out. Aiko turned back into the room and carefully closed the crate once more. Tomorrow would bring new patients and new questions from villagers who had heard the story spreading along the coast. She knew that they would ask about the Americans who had arrived with medical bags instead of rifles. They would ask about the captain who had knelt beside a wounded child without hesitation. Aiko realized that when she answered those questions, she would not speak about enemies or armies. She would speak about something far simpler that she had witnessed with her own eyes. A doctor who believed that healing came before victory, and that the smallest patient in the room could still be the most important one. The village slept quietly beneath the soft glow of early dawn when the first pale light began to rise above the distant ocean. A thin mist drifted over the narrow road that curved past the schoolhouse and down toward the harbor, carrying the cool scent of salt and wet earth. Inside the building, the lantern had burned low during the night, leaving only a faint golden glow across the wooden desks and the empty floor where the long day of work had unfolded. Aiko Tanaka stood near the doorway as the morning air slipped through the broken windows, bringing with it the quiet promise of another day. She had slept only briefly, resting against the wall beside the crate of medical supplies the Americans had left behind. Yet the tiredness in her body was mixed with something calmer now, a sense that the events of the previous day had settled into a clear memory she would never lose. Near the window, the small boy stirred beneath the blanket and slowly sat up, rubbing his eyes as the pale sunlight touched the bandage wrapped around his arm. His mother smiled gently when she saw him awake, brushing the dust from his sleeve while whispering that the doctors would come back today. The boy looked toward the doorway as if he already believed it. Outside, the quiet village had begun to wake. Fishermen walked slowly along the road toward the harbor, pausing occasionally to glance toward the schoolhouse where the story of the previous day had already become something the entire village understood. American soldiers had arrived, but they had not come to conquer the village. They had come carrying medical bags. They had knelt beside a wounded child. They had worked beside the village nurses as if there had never been a line separating one side from the other. Aiko stepped out into the cool morning air and looked along the road that stretched toward the hills. The dust from yesterday's tire tracks still marked the ground, pale lines that curved into the distance. For a moment the road remained empty. Then, far beyond the bend where the peach trees grew thick along the edge of the hillside, a faint sound drifted through the quiet morning. The low, steady hum of an engine. Aiko stood still as the sound grew clearer. Soon the familiar shape of a jeep appeared along the road, sunlight reflecting softly from the metal hood as it approached the village. Another vehicle followed close behind. The promise made the evening before had not been forgotten. The doctors had returned. The boy near the window heard the engine and rushed to the doorway, stopping beside Aiko as the vehicles rolled slowly toward the schoolhouse once more. Captain Daniel Whitaker stepped down from the jeep, just as he had the day before, the same medical bag resting against his side, his sleeves rolled neatly above his elbows. For a brief moment, he looked toward the doorway where Aiko and the boy stood waiting. Then he gave the same calm nod he had given when he first entered the village. No speech was necessary. The work would begin again exactly where it had ended. And in that quiet moment, as the morning sun rose above the ocean behind them, Aiko understood that the memory of the previous day would travel far beyond this small village. Because sometimes the smallest decisions made in the middle of war could echo longer than the war itself. A doctor kneeling beside a child. 3 simple words spoken without hesitation. Children first.